just carry on, just starting talking.
Well, we are live now, and I'd like to kick it off by asking you what you think about driver performance, and specifically thinking about what we have with George Russell coming into the mix with Mercedes, and then potentially having a race-winning car in 23, or at least being thereabouts with Ferrari and Red Bull. How do you think we would judge George's performance, his ability to compete against Lewis, given that he has a 7-time champion in the mix there? How do you feel about George being able to live up to the expectations?
I mean, I guess it's a good question, isn't it? Because he presumably expected to start his first season in Mercedes with a car that was capable of winning a championship, and didn't get that. And so the parameters of his performance are sort of slightly different, in that, you know, when you're fighting for fifth or sixth on the grid, you're not really fighting. I guess the mentality that you go into each race isn't the same. Like your aim isn't just to maximize your position, but it's also to try and find ways to improve the car, which is kind of how that played out last season. But I mean, it's the whole question about how George is performing right now. I guess it's a fairly easy question to answer, in that he's performed really well against Lewis. You know, from a statistical point of view, he won more races in 2022, and he outscored Lewis over the course of the season as well. Now, that doesn't tell the full story of how that played out and why it played out like that. But by any metric, even if you look at how close they were in qualifying stats, which is often the most pure way to assess their relative pace, there was hundreds between them over the course of the season. So George definitely knows what he's doing. But I guess the question that I was asked initially was, you know, how do we think that George will stack up when there actually is a championship on the line? What do you think about that? Like how do you think? Like, let me ask you a different question. 3 driver examples, right? You've had Max, Charles, and now you've got George on the cusp of a championship challenge, right? So of those, if you had to rate all 3 out of 10, how do you think they rated when the championship challenge came?
The problem with rating George in that particular equation is that Mercedes was not in the mix for any of this,
Okay,
right?
sure.
But
So I'm asking for a prediction rather than a.
Yeah, I would. I mean, it's hard not to go with the incumbent, right? So I'd have to go with Max, just because he's been so dominant. And even in 2021, although the last race went the way it did, I mean, he presumably could have won that outright as well. So just the overall consistency of performance and just the driving of the car, it seems like Max and Charles and Lewis are sort of at a different level than everyone. I think George is an outlier, right? In that we have not seen Mercedes be competitive. If they were competitive, I'd reckon that him and Lewis would be going at it, because that's been the nature of Mercedes, generally speaking, to let 2 strong drivers compete, a la Nico Rosberg, right? So I could see that. And I actually think that with him coming into Mercedes with Lewis there, I think it is only worked wonders for him in terms of learning how to be a pro's pro, and learning how to drive with a championship winning car potentially, if and when they have it. So
okay, let me go back a step, right? So you said that you know, Max and Charles are sort of a cut above. So were you happy with the way that Charles performed in 2022 in the, you know, when the championship came knocking?
Yeah, for the most part. France being the outlier. And I would argue that that mistake from Charles was also something that was induced, right, by the fact that Ferrari had a string of missteps. I don't know if there's a way to prove it, but I think it could be argued that he felt the pressure to perform a certain way to maximize, chances when it was in his hand, and probably took it a step too far. Not probably, he did take it a step too far, but um, that error was a culmination of a lot of different things that were happening in the background.
Yeah, and I guess I'm honest. This is where I want to come to. Right? Is that something we could have predicted? Like, could we predict that that's what Charles was going to do? That he'd be fast, but when the pressure really started to mount, he might do something silly. Was there anything in his makeup that?
Yeah, we've seen mistakes over the course of the years, right? So yes, he has been mistake prone too, but he's also turned up with the best one lap performance that anyone has.
Yeah, but
right?
okay, yeah, I agree, but we knew he was going to do that already.
Yeah,
When you say that somebody was when someone says to me that, when a driver is fighting for a championship, they suddenly elevate themselves to another level. I think I have a bit of a problem with that. Right? I don't think that a driver in a high pressure situation, even higher pressure than they are in a normal race situation, in a normal championship season where there's not a tight fight between contenders. I don't think that a driver necessarily learns a new skill and elevates themselves that way. I think there's a subtle difference to the way that they perform in that setting, in a championship setting, when they're when they're nip and tuck with their rival. And we can examine a few different drivers to see how that plays out, right? So one of the things that was interesting, I thought, about 2021 was the way that everybody talked about Lewis and Max elevating themselves to a level higher than everybody else, right? And the question I've got to ask you is, again, is that something that we kind of predicted was going to happen anyway? That, like, if you went into that season knowing those two drivers, what they've done before and what they're capable of, could we predict that was what was going to happen?
No, we couldn't have, but we could not have predicted Red Bull being as competitive as Mercedes
Okay,
in
but
2021 either.
let's equalize for that. Let's say the cars, let's say, because that's what this whole argument is predicated on, right? Is that the cars are equal enough that those two drivers can can both fight for a title. So both of them are in a car that's capable of winning a championship, right?
Mm-hmm.
Could we have predicted that Lewis and Max would elevate themselves to a level higher than everybody else on the grid?
I would say yes. And the reason for that is it's quite simple in some ways, because if you are fighting for a championship, then your level of focus changes compared to you being a midfielder. I mean, your objective changes, right? You have different sets of goals versus being in Aston Martin and just maybe trying to get out of the first lap without, getting caught in the melee that happens in some of the races, right? So I think that just by virtue of that, if you are at the front and you are competing for a championship, and then if you have someone else in a similar car that is just as capable as you are of winning it, the margin for error decreases, your focus increases, and assuming you have the championship hunger and drive that these drivers clearly do, then it's a matter of inches, right, and seconds and milliseconds, right, in some ways. So I think that there is the ability to push yourself to do even better, or to maximize everything that you have to offer in those situations.
Right. So yeah, right. So I think that's key, right? That it's about maximizing what you have.
What you have.
Right.
Right.
So if you look at sort of Max's career is quite an interesting one, right? So Max came into the sport in 2015, and he contends, and he did at the end of 21, that He's been performing at that level the whole time. And actually, if he'd been given a car that was capable of winning a championship in his first season in Formula One, he would have either been competing at least or fighting for the title, right? I'm going to throw it to you. Do you agree with that? Like, do you think that that's true? If you
Is there
saw,
anyone who wouldn't say that? Is there any driver who wouldn't say that? Give me a championship worthy car and see what I can do, or make a car as that works with my driving style, and I'll
yeah,
get the
sure,
most
but
out
I
of it.
think with most drivers, you could arguably say that's probably not true, right? That they have to learn some skills to equip them to be able to fight for that championship, right? Now, my question is, did Max have those skills day one?
That's a difficult one to answer, right? How do we know that? How do we know that?
Well, we've watched his career from 2015 to
But
2021.
when you're starting in a Toro Rosso, it's a different thing, right? How do you?
Okay, yeah, go on.
So how do you know? Yeah, you're right. I'm sure that every driver comes in with different levels of abilities, and they probably are not the same. Um, you don't. It's some of them are probably genuinely fast, and I think you can see that, right? Like, I mean, I would go to Leclerc and Sainz, right? Like, you can tell the differences between the two. It's quite clear. One guy is really really fast, but error prone. The other guy has a slow start, but can be Mr. Consistent, right?
Yeah.
So I think that that's true. I mean, it's hard to argue against Max's statement just because he has. Well, now he's proven. He's won 2 championships, and
Now
yeah,
he has, right?
yeah,
But I would argue that like there were a lot of holes in his armory back in 2015 that he's
sure,
filled in along the way. Like his qualifying record against Carlos Sainz in that first season
was
wasn't
bad.
that great,
Yep.
right?
Mhm.
His wheel to wheel ability, not even ability, his wheel to wheel decision making has evolved over that time to a point that it was deployable aggressively and effectively in
Mhm.
2021 in a
Mhm.
way that if he tried to do what he did in 2021 with the skills that he had in 2015, I think he would have been penalized every step of the way. But
Indeed.
he had used his formative years effectively to test out all these little things, find where the line is, and then nail that line when the time comes. And I guess Max is actually a really good example of what I'm saying. That I think when you're not in a championship fight, and um, by that I don't mean that you're not fighting for a championship, because you can be in a 2002 Ferrari and waltzing off into the distance. And I think the skills you need to do that are different to what you need when you're actually going toe to toe with somebody else in similar equipment. But I think in that scenario, in that latter scenario, um, you don't have the time to be developing a skill that you didn't have before. That needs to come
Indeed. Yeah.
in the seasons where you weren't doing those things. And because of that, I think you can to some extent predict how somebody's going to perform in a season where they're actually up for a championship. Now that doesn't necessarily predict whether or not they're going to win that championship, or whether or not they're going to beat somebody with a potentially better set of skills,
Mhm.
or more appropriate skills. But it does give you an idea of how well they're going to, like, what they're going to do, right? Um, and as I say, I think Max is a good example of that, because he's, over the course of the 7 years before he had a shot at a title, you could see him ironing out those, each and every one of those negative points. The qualifying got better, the wheel to wheel decision making, although we maybe didn't like it, actually it was very effective, and he tested out what the line was before he got
Mhm.
into 2021. The tire management got better and better and better. How to manage that particular car got better and better and better. So it means that when he's actually in a crunch situation, he's not having to think about it. Like, those things come naturally to him, and he's got spare capacity to do the other things that he needs to, and that's what makes him look good in that situation. And I think Lewis is similar. And I think from by his own admission, every single season he says that he's going out to find those weaknesses and iron those out. And it's easier to do that, I think, in a season where you're not fighting for a championship, right? It's like 2020, I'm sure he learned much more than he did in 2021 in terms of how to actually drive the car and what he can do to be better. Because what you don't want, I think, is to be learning those skills in that tight situation, because then you're going to start making mistakes, I think.
I think that's fair. I think although I don't think that that's the only way to do it, right? But I think Max's example is really great in that he did have time to develop, the ability to be a race winner and have that killer instinct too. I mean, he always had that, but just to hone it, refine it, and as you said, walk up to the line, sometimes slightly get a foot over it, but really be highly effective. Am I right in thinking that he was also picked to start in Formula One pretty early, right? He started at a really early age too, so perhaps there's something to do with that too, where as you're still in your formative years, the earlier you get to join the sport. And presumably, Red Bull's race driver development program is one of the best, right, in terms of just being able to get the mentoring and the support around you. I think that comes into play as well. I would argue, I mean, Lewis was about to win in 2007 too. I guess he learned some of those mistakes firsthand, but it was a matter of inches in that season too, right? In some ways.
Yeah.
So,
okay. But as I say, this isn't about whether or not you're going to win a championship or not, right?
No, but
this is about whether or not you have the skills requisite to fight another guy. And Lewis is a good example, right? That so I was on another podcast somewhere else where Max and early Lewis could be seen as quite similar. I think that's true. But I think Lewis, as quick as he was, and the racecraft that he had, still wasn't the finished article, right? There was still a lot of race awareness that he didn't have, tire awareness that he didn't really have at that point. Even at that point, he also had a bit of a reputation for being hard on his tires at that point, and that's something that's developed as the seasons have gone on, right? And all of those things, if you look at it, the race awareness, the wheel to wheel, the split second decision making, are all things that in some ways cost him that title. China wouldn't have happened if he'd been able to be more forceful over the radio and say, look, my tires aren't up to it. He wouldn't have gone for that Dan Dare turn 4 move in Brazil in the last race, with a little bit more circumspection about what the right decision is. But all of those things have come, and you wouldn't expect 2021 or 2022 Lewis to lose that title. And he'd probably have made 2008 much more comfortable as well, I think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I guess the question then is, what is the more effective career, right? Is it early Max or early Lewis, right? Because they've had sort of the opposite trajectory in that Lewis came into a very competitive, first couple of years, right? With McLaren. I mean, they were right there. And and on the opposite end, Max didn't come into anything like that. What has been more effective? I guess part of me thinks that this is so much about your individual personality as a driver, your ability to take all of these things in, right? Not just the racing aspect of it, but just your ability to develop and mature as a professional, and how you take feedback and performance criticism and analysis, and then take that back to you, and how quickly can you adapt to the situations. Also what what matters. And Max had a good runway up to it, so clearly he was ready for 21. And had 21 not happened, he would have definitely gotten 22 as well. So clearly he was right there. So he was super competitive. They were just, had Red Bull been a little bit more competitive earlier on, maybe even 2020, right? I mean, who knows what that would have looked like had Red Bull been competitive.
I agree with that. I think 2020, 2021 Max, I think he'd started to peak in 2020, and he was just able to show that in 2021 in a car that was able to do it. But if we then bring that back to Charles, and you kind of have to go, okay, so 2021, we maybe didn't see so many of the sort of big mistakes, but they were still there, right? Mm-hmm. He still dumped it in the wall in qualifying in Monaco, didn't he, in 2021? Mm-hmm. And you kind of have to say, well, he was doing that in 2019 in Baku, right? Mm-hmm. That error was in him in 2019, and it was still there in 2021. And then we saw it again in 2022. But you kind of have to go that the pace has always been there, right? We know that he's one of the quickest, if not the quickest, over one lap on the grid at the moment. But that's been there for 2 or 3 seasons. We could have predicted that was going to happen. But we could also probably have predicted that he had a mistake in him as well when the pressure hits, because he was still dumping it in the wall in 2021, despite having done it 2 years earlier. Yeah, and maybe that's just a function of the way that Charles drives, but what you'd expect of someone that is ready to fight for a championship is that they would have found a way to go back, analyze, like you said, take the feedback. All right, how do I keep the pace that I've got, but iron out those errors? And you can see that is something that Max did. But yeah, I mean, he had 7 years to do it. Charles had 3 seasons from 2018 to 4 seasons, 2018 to 2021, to try and iron those things out. And he didn't quite get there, which is why, for me, I don't think he was quite ready in the same way that Max was for his 2021 title shot. And of course, Ferrari played a massive part in that. Before someone who listens to this like fires one out, a silo off at me, obviously, like, Ferrari played a massive part in that. But if you're gonna analyze Charles individually, that was still there.
Okay, but let me ask you this: what did Lewis and Max have throughout their early years that Charles hasn't had?
A competitive car? Is that what you're going to say?
Not just that. I mean, the competitive cars are not more or less than competitive team. I mean, we talked about this with the Ferrari team principal chain. Yeah. I mean, look at what the environment is compared to the other two environments, right? Yeah. I mean, even I know with all the issues that McLaren had in 2007, they still had a very well functioning organizational unit, right? That, and Mercedes, as we know,
did they 2007? Didn't they get fined $100 million that season?
But I mean, come on, I believe Ron Dennis when he says he didn't know anything about it.
Yeah, but that makes it even worse.
But you know what I'm saying? I mean, that's an ethical question, right? I totally agree with that. But I think just from the standpoint of what is a driver equipped with, that's outside of the car, right? How does the unit operate? And they haven't had that. So I guess you could argue that on the one hand, Charles was being reckless. On the other hand, I could argue that he is not getting the proper mentorship and guidance, and nobody's actually telling him. Or I don't know how the Ferrari structure works in terms of how communication with driver works, and how they're trying to improve their drivers as opposed to just improving the car, right? But it seems like that's a lacking quality.
I mean, but Amar, that's all part of it, right? That's all part of it. Yes, that is out of his control. But if we're talking about a driver reaching his ultimate potential, yes, I agree that Charles hasn't had the environment that Max and Lewis have had to foster that. But what I'm talking about is if you take all of that away, right, and you're just left with the driver and what they are able to do on the day, regardless of the history that they've had coming up to that outside the car, just what they've done in the car. If you had to put Max, Lewis, and Sean, all three of them in the same car, and they're all gunning for a title at the same time, I could tell you that I think Lewis is going to be super fast, good on his tires, and circumspect in a wheel-to-wheel situation. I think Max is going to be lightning over a lap, really good on his tires, and Dan Dare into a braking zone against the rival. And I think Charles will be the quickest of all three over a qualifying lap, but every now and again will dump it in the wall. And I think that from seeing what they've done, and that's regardless of what their teams have been like.
Totally. I mean, just like Max and Lewis had their flaws and that they had to overcome it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think Charles has to overcome that too. He has just been downright reckless, I think is the right word, is to do what he's done. And you even take France away. I mean, Monaco is a great example of it. Azerbaijan is a great example of that too, right? He's done that a couple of times over there too.
Yeah, I mean, reckless is maybe a little harsh in that. I think it's just the way he drives the car means that every now and again that will happen to him.
Maybe that's the price to pay for it. Maybe that is the price.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But the trick for him is to now get to a point where he can keep the pace and not have the errors. But
or maybe
that's
or maybe lose a little bit of the pace in exchange for just being far more reliable. And maybe that is part of the growth as a driver, is that you figure out how to how to complete races as opposed to just completing qualifying, right?
And
to be competitive,
I was just trying to think of other examples, right? So somebody had quoted to me beforehand that Damon Hill had said that when he had a championship fight on his hands, suddenly everything was heightened. And I think he is kind of saying what I'm saying as well, that actually it's not that you suddenly discover skills that you didn't have. It's that the skills that you do have are amplified and they're absolutely on the limit of what they can be. But what I guess he didn't say was that also your weaknesses can be amplified as well. They haven't gone away. They're still there. And if we look at other examples, we will come back, I guess, to the question of how we predict George is going to do in the midst of a championship. But there are other drivers that we can sort of analyze from that point of view as well. And I think so. We talked about this briefly before we started recording, but Felipe Massa, I think, is an excellent example of this. That as soon as he got in a Ferrari, he had a certain style that meant that circuits where he needed to be hard on the brakes, turn the car quickly, really suited him. So he was really good in Bahrain. He was really good in Turkey. He was really good in Interlagos. And
everywhere else.
When he was finally in a championship fight, he did the same thing. Those are the races that he was absolutely all over. But he, for me, is a slight exception to the rule in that he did start to do some stuff that he wouldn't have done normally, and that he started to become much more aggressive when a championship was on the line. And my example of that is in Hungary, where off the start he's second in 2008. This was Hungary 2008. He's starting second, and against Lewis, who's on pole. And into the first corner, he brakes, locks up, goes around the outside, and takes the lead, and would have won that race if his engine hadn't blown up with 3 laps to go. But that's the only example I can think of a driver doing something completely from the left field in terms of their own portfolio. In the midst of a championship fight. I can't think of another example where drivers have learned new skills in that scenario. But that's why we're having a discussion. Maybe I've missed something.
Yeah, but is that a skill, or is it just being more aggressive? Is that you as the driver just taking certain calculated risks, right? To say, okay, this is where I'll send it in and see what happens, kind of thing. Where and these decisions are probably made in a split second as
Yeah,
you get in there, right? I don't know. Yeah, I mean, go ahead. What were you gonna say? You were gonna say
I
something.
was going to say that yeah, I take that. I take that point, but actually the split second decision is made much more reliable if you've had to do it before,
Mhm. That's
right?
true. That's true. Yeah, I mean, he he is a bit of an outlier in that case. I also think this is so driver experiences are so not monolithic, right? Like you, depending on where you start, when you start, what the team environment is, how soon you get to be in a competitive car, how soon can you prepare yourself to be
Mm.
competitive is such a random thing in my mind, because if you, again, as we said, you put Lewis in effectively a championship winning car in 2007, and for all the flaws he had, he was very competitive. I mean, could we
Mm.
argue the same for anyone else being in there? Maybe not. So I think it's it's a bit of a where you're at and when you're at kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about it now. I guess the flip side to all of this is that okay, like perhaps you don't win the title in that circumstance, and maybe you do. Maybe you do win it in that tight scenario, um, but you've done it despite your flaws still being there. You've at least shown to yourself that those flaws are there, and that when you're next in a fight for a title and you need to iron things out, um, that those are the things you need to go away and work on. And I think that's really what will separate the out and out greats from the merely very 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 good. Um,
Yeah, I also wonder how much of your pre-Formula One days prepare you to bring
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, some of this is God-given, right? You're born with certain talents, so of course it's hard to measure that. But I mean, again, these guys are just Lewis and Max. They're just right from the get-go. And Charles, I think is a little bit on the to be determined side, because we have to see that consistent performance, and we also have to hope to see a consistent team performance to go alongside that, to say that is it's there or not there. But I think
yeah.
these two
I
are.
think that's much harder. So if we bring this back to what we were talking about, to how do we think that George is going to do if there's a championship on the line? Um,
Crystal ball moment.
yeah, what do you think?
I don't know. What do you think?
That's a nice
given
return.
how
You'd be
given
good at tennis.
look, I'll say what I said before. I think there are conceivably four drivers that could win the championship, assuming Mercedes is on there. But if we were to pick who the four are, the fourth driver would be George, right?
Yeah, yeah,
It's
I think
fair to
so.
see that, right? Could you argue Carlos? Maybe if he starts off well, and we'll know maybe in the first 2-3 races of the season whether he's in it
Yeah,
or not. But I
yeah.
think George has shown last year that he can be competitive. So I think it's fair from that standpoint to assume that he would be in the mix.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think he will be. I think he would be in the mix. I think he's definitely shown that from a pace point of view, he's almost there. And this is against Lewis, right? And we can go into the ifs and buts of that in a second. Wheel to wheel, he's shown that he's aggressive enough. Sometimes maybe a little too aggressive, but that was certainly in the early part of the season. Um, and in some of his Williams interactions when he finally had a car that could race against somebody else,
That's the other thing too.
right? Um, but yeah, I mean, in terms of the basic points that he needs, he's excelling. So yeah, you absolutely expect him to be there. Whether or not, if all things being completely equal, right? So there's no crashes, there's no safety cars, there's no um like all the strategy that you put out there plays out exactly how you want it to play out, and you maximize every single weekend. I think in that situation, where George lacks a little bit is just in that ultimate last bit of pace. And there was, I was listening to a few podcasts before we recorded this, and you can see it in the data towards the end of the season when Lewis was in a car that was a bit more to his liking, that he developed in that, that he'd had a big hand in developing in that direction. He started to really like turn it up. Qualifying was better. Race pace was better. He was starting to finish ahead. Okay, Brazil notwithstanding, he was starting to eke out a bit of an edge on George, and I guess this is what it comes. This is where this argument comes back full circle for me, right? Is, have I seen enough to say that George over the winter is going to have gone away, processed that, and gone, right, this is what I need to do to get that last little bit of pace that's going to make it comfortable for me? And I don't know. Yeah. Right now, I'd have to say he probably hasn't. Right, there isn't enough evidence to say that he has done that. Does he have the ability to do that? Probably. I just don't know that he will have done it. And doing it in the simulator, I think, is different to doing it for real in the car, and proving to yourself that you can do that. And I think that's part of it. And it will take a few races in the season, even if he has developed something, for him to come to terms with the fact that he can do this, and there's another level that he has unlocked.
Yeah, I think of two things when I think about this too. Is, of course, as you said, the pace, but I think back to a 23 race season, right? This is it's a long season, and being able to maintain pace advantage. I mean, just being able to play the long game, right, is quite there. And Lewis is a pro at it. Also, Lewis is great at mind games too, right? As we've seen in the past.
All part of it.
So
all part of it.
How is George going to keep up with it? Last year was nothing to do with that because they were not competitive. So it was all, it felt like, almost like a buddy system a little bit, right?
But I say that mind games are one of the strengths that George already has. He's quite good at sort of like downplaying anything that looks a bit bad, or just kind of making the calls that the team don't necessarily want it to make, and then you end up with radio like Lewis's, where he's like, you guys just screwed me over. So it's not like George doesn't know how to play the game. And I think that's one of his strengths. I don't think that will come out as a weakness if I had to predict things.
I don't say it's a weakness, but I cannot put it at the same level as Lewis's ability, right? I mean, Lewis, after all, learned from the greatest of this, Fernando Alonso. Like that's where he learned all. He's experienced in being at the other end of this for a little bit in 2007. But I think you're right. He is capable. And I would say the same thing is actually true for Carlos too, right? He's made some calls from outside the pit wall that has made you think, wow. So I think
so I would say that's one of Lewis's weaknesses right now, is that he's been a little too reliant on the pit wall, especially in 2022. When there's been marginal calls, and actually he could have just gone with what he felt. Hungary last season was another good one where everybody else pitted, and he's lumped on the grid on his own. He should have been the one to say, guys, actually, like, my tires aren't right for these conditions. We should be coming in right now. So that I think is a weakness of Lewis's, and it's one that could conceivably cost him if things are tight. You know what I mean? And he's had seasons and seasons and seasons to try and iron those things out. And sometimes it's worrying to see those things come in, because it suggests that actually he either hasn't had the opportunity or hasn't recognized that is something that he needed to work on.
Yeah. And I would imagine that no matter what, there would be some errors that would come along the way. Like in every season, you're going to have one or two of those moments. Hopefully it's not catastrophic, and hopefully it's not more than one or two of those moments, right? Because if it is a competitive season, and we're all hoping it is a competitive season, then it would really not there would not be a whole lot of room for error there, and I think that'll be interesting to see
Yeah.
how those mind games work out, right? Because
Yeah.
I think Mercedes is the only team that'll have to deal with this situation a little bit more than, and certainly not Red Bull, and maybe not Ferrari. So
Yeah, I mean, I think Ferrari have got a whole bunch of other issues to kind of deal with. But if Carlos comes out the gate swinging, it's a different proposition, I think, at Ferrari. Because if he's comfortable with the car immediately, um, then I think he's got a full set of cards to play with. I don't think he makes the same errors that Charles does. He maybe doesn't have the ultimate pace.
yeah,
But Charles has got an error or two in the locker that seems inherent to the way he drives.
yeah.
Whereas I don't think Carlos has necessarily got that. If he's got pace that's comparable, that could really cost Charles. You know, but I guess you do have to balance that against the fact that the car will probably still be a bit of a handful to drive. Fast, but probably only in the hands of one of those two drivers,
Yeah.
at least initially.
And I don't see Carlos beating Charles in qualifying, and that's going to be a big barrier for him.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that.
I mean, if he can be right there with Charles, even if he's not beating them, then I think he's going to be okay. But I think that'd be interesting. There's so many. This is the fun sort of storyline to look at for next season too. And
yeah,
I think it would be really nice to see a competitive Mercedes, really to just be able to see how two drivers bring the best out of one another.
Yeah,
after
I mean, ideally, I'd like to see a competitive Ferrari, Mercedes, and Red Bull, all three of them, all gunning for it. And it comes back to what we were talking about on the last one about whether or not having a strong teammate alongside you is necessarily a bad thing. And I think again, this comes down to being able to compare your strengths and weaknesses against any driver, and it doesn't matter whether they're in the same car as you or not, because you still have to bring the same strengths and weaknesses to bear in a championship fight. Yeah. You're still fighting with the same tools, whether the other driver's in the garage next door or down the road.
And the first guy you want to beat is the guy next door. That's the first guy you want to beat at all times. So there's that too, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'll take that point. I'll take that.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. Okay. What do we think? Want to keep? Yeah. We're at an hour now. I think we'll have 51 minutes. So this is probably one of the smaller ones, I think.
Yeah. But that's cool, man. That was. I mean, we're still recording, but that was.
I will pause now, but yeah.